The morning Hazel Orin walked into Bergen's Pawn and Trade with her deployment box tucked under one arm, she told herself it was just stuff, metal and ribbon, things you could replace. She was wrong about that. She knew it the moment she set the box on the glass counter, and the lid fell open on its own, the way it always did, because the hinge had been bent since Kandahar, and she'd never bothered to fix it. The man behind the counter, 50s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a coffee ring on his polo shirt, looked down at the contents, then up at her, then back down. "These are military decorations," he said. "I know what they are. Ma'am, I'm not sure I can. Can you give me a number or not?" His name was Bergen himself, as it turned out. Second generation, ran the shop the way his father had, which meant he kept a handwritten ledger and didn't like confrontation. He gave her a number. It was lower than she'd hoped and higher than she'd expected, which was the math of desperation, and Hazel had gotten very good at that math over the past 4 months. She didn't say yes right away. She stood there with her hand on the counter and looked at the bronze star. The ribbon was a little frayed at one corner. She'd caught it on a locker hook back at Bagram, hadn't noticed until formation. She thought about the 11 months it had taken to earn it, the way her hands had shaken the morning after, the smell of the field hospital at 3 in the morning when you've been standing for 16 hours and you still have 4 more to go. She thought about the eviction notice on her kitchen table. 48 hours. The number Bergen had offered would buy her maybe 6 weeks. "Let me think about it," she said, and stepped away from the counter. That was when the dog walked over. It came from the back of the shop, or seemed to, though she hadn't heard a door, hadn't noticed anyone come in. A Belgian Malinois, lean and dark-faced, wearing a vest she recognized. Working dog. Not a pet. It moved with the particular economy of an animal that had been trained by people who didn't waste motion. It stopped directly in front of her deployment box. It put its nose down to the glass, sniffed once, and then did something she'd never seen a dog do in a pawn shop or anywhere else. It sat, square and deliberate, the way they sit when they're indicating. The trained posture, spine straight, weight settled, like it had found what it was looking for. "Bravo!" The voice came from near the door, and she turned. The man was maybe 40, in civilian clothes that fit the way civilian clothes never quite fit on people who'd spent years in uniform. Slightly too neat, slightly too deliberate, like he was always aware of how he was standing. He had a leash in one hand and a look on his face that she couldn't immediately read. "Sorry about him," the man said. "He does that sometimes." Hazel looked at the dog. The dog was not looking at her. It was still looking at the box. "What's he indicating on?" she asked. The man came a few steps closer, and she saw his eyes drop to the open box, saw them go still. "Where did you serve?" he said. She almost told him it wasn't his business. She would have, 4 months ago. 4 months ago, she'd had a job and an apartment, and a reason to be careful about strangers. "Army Nurse Corps," she said. 2 deployments, Bagram. Then a FA-B outside Kandahar. She paused. "You?" "Marines Force Recon, 3 tours." He looked at the bronze star again. "That's a combat decoration, yes. You earned it in theater?" "I did." He was quiet for a moment. The dog still hadn't moved. "My name is Sutter," he said. "Cole Sutter. Hazel Orin. What are you doing in a pawn shop, Orin?" She almost laughed. It wasn't funny. It was the kind of question that wasn't really a question. It was someone opening a door and waiting to see if you'd walk through it. And she was tired enough and broke enough and just defeated enough that she walked through it. She told him. Not everything, not right away, but the shape of it, the job, the termination, the 4 months of fighting it. She'd been a charge nurse at Dillard General, a mid-sized hospital in a mid-sized city where the administration had recently been absorbed into a larger health system from out of state. The new system had brought new HR protocols and a new VP of operations named Marsh, who had arrived in January with a reorganization plan and the particular energy of a man who had never set foot in an ICU but had very strong opinions about efficiency metrics. In March, Marsh had cited Hazel for insubordination after she'd refused to discharge a patient she believed was septic. The patient had been septic. He'd been readmitted 8 hours later, transferred to the ICU, and had nearly died. Hazel had documented everything. She'd filed an internal complaint. She'd gone to the charge nurse union rep, who had been sympathetic and entirely ineffective. In April, they'd fired her. The stated reason was a paperwork discrepancy from 6 months prior. a medication log she'd signed off on that the new system flagged as non-compliant with their documentation standards. It was technical, it was airtight, she was fairly certain, selected specifically because it gave them cover. She'd hired a lawyer with her savings. The lawyer had said the case had merit and would take time. Time, it turned out, cost money she no longer had. Sutter listened to all of this without interrupting, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. Most people either jumped in with advice or started looking for an exit. He just listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How long until the eviction?" 48 hours. He looked at the dog. The dog looked at the box. "Don't sell those," he said. "I don't particularly want to. I mean it." He pulled out his phone. "I know someone. She does veteran employment cases. Not just military, she takes medical professionals with combat service backgrounds. If what you're describing is retaliation, and it sounds like it is, there may be federal angles here you're not seeing. I have a lawyer. Is your lawyer familiar with the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act and how it intersects with whistleblower protections in federally funded hospital systems?" She stared at him. "Because that's a specific combination," he said, "and it matters here." Her lawyer had not mentioned you, Sarah. Not once. She let him make the call. The attorney's name was Vasquez. She was in her late 40s, had a voice like someone who had stopped being surprised by anything years ago, and she asked Hazel 3 questions in the first 90 seconds of the call that made Hazel realize she had been fighting with the wrong tools. Dillard General received federal funding. That mattered. The new parent company had a history of what Vasquez called compliance theater, documented complaints from other acquired facilities, 2 of which had settled quietly in the past 18 months. That mattered more. "The medication log they used to fire you," Vasquez said. "Was that flagged before or after you filed the internal complaint about Marsh?" Hazel thought about it. "After? How long after?" 10 days. Vasquez said something that wasn't quite a word. "And you have the complaint documentation? Time-stamped?" "I have everything. I kept everything." "Good. Don't touch any of it. Don't send it to anyone. I'm going to need you to come in tomorrow. I have an eviction in 48 hours. There was a pause. Then Vasquez said, "Let me make one more call." Hazel didn't know what that call contained. She found out later, through a chain of events she couldn't have predicted and still didn't fully understand, that Vasquez had called someone at the state medical board, who had called someone at the hospital's parent company, who had apparently called someone at the company's legal department, and that the phrase "federal whistleblower protection in conjunction with you, Sarah," had traveled through that chain with the speed of something no one wanted to be holding when the music stopped. What she knew in the moment was that 2 hours after that call, she got a voicemail from Dillard General's chief nursing officer, a woman named Alderton, whom she had never spoken to, offering her a conversation. The voicemail was careful. It did not admit anything, but it existed, and 4 months of fighting had taught Hazel what it meant when the other side suddenly wanted to have a conversation. She called Alderton back from Sutter's truck because she was still in the parking lot of Bergen's Pawn and Trade, and her phone was at 12% battery, and he had a charger. Bravo was in the back seat, chin on his paws, watching the strip mall with the mild interest of a dog who had done much harder things than this. The conversation with Alderton lasted 20 minutes. Hazel said very little. Alderton said a great deal, in the practiced language of institutional damage control, and underneath all of it was an offer. Reinstatement, back pay for the 4 months, a formal retraction of the termination documentation. "No apology," Hazel said when Alderton finished. A pause. "We'd prefer to handle this through. I didn't ask what you prefer." She was looking at the deployment box, still sitting on the passenger seat where she'd put it when she left the shop. The Bronze Star, the 2 Army Commendation Medals, the ribbon with the small nick in the corner. "I want a written apology. Formal on letterhead, signed by Marsh and by the hospital's CNO. I want it on record that the termination was retaliatory and without merit, and I want the complaint about the septic patient reviewed by an independent clinical panel." Another pause, longer this time. The last item would require, "I know what it requires," Hazel said. "I'm a nurse. I know exactly what it requires, and I know why you don't want to do it, And I want you to understand that I have kept every piece of documentation from the last 4 months, and I have an attorney who does not find federal whistleblower cases complicated." She paused. "So, Alderton said she'd need to confer with legal. Take your time," Hazel said. "I have 46 hours." She hung up. Sutter, who had been very carefully looking at the strip mall, turned and looked at her. "That was different from how you were talking 20 minutes ago," he said. She realized he was right. 20 minutes ago, she had been someone who was about to sell her medals. "That dog," she said. "Why did he sit like that?" Sutter glanced at Bravo in the rearview mirror. Trained response. "He does it with veterans. Combat veterans specifically. Something in the cortisol profile, maybe, or the particular way people carry themselves when they've been through sustained high-stress environments. The researchers aren't sure. He started doing it on his own, before we even knew it was a thing. He knew before I said anything. He usually does." She thought about that. The dog had sat before she'd spoken a single word about her service, before Sutter had known anything about her. Something in her scent or her posture or whatever it was that dogs knew that people spent years in MRIs trying to understand. Something in her that was still military, still shaped by the field hospitals and the rotations and the particular weight of being the person in the room who had to stay calm when nothing was calm, and Bravo had read it in the time it took to cross a floor. She reached back and let him sniff her hand. He did, with the careful thoroughness of an animal at work. Then he put his chin back on his paws. The eviction was stayed. It took 3 phone calls and a letter from Vasquez that she said she'd drafted in 40 minutes, but that read like it had taken considerably longer. Dense with specific statutory references, citing 2 precedent cases, CC'd to 4 different regulatory bodies. The landlord's attorney called back within the hour. Some things, Vasquez said afterward, just needed the right language. The formal response from Dillard General took 11 days. Hazel spent those 11 days at her sister's house in Westbrook, sleeping in the guest room, eating her sister's cooking, being subjected to her sister's 4-year-old, who was at the stage where everything was a question and most of the questions didn't have answers. Why is the sky blue? Why do dogs have 4 legs? Why are you sad? I'm not sad, Hazel told him on the 3rd day. He looked at her with the unimpressed clarity of a child who has not yet learned that adults expect you to believe them. You look sad, he said, and went back to his cereal. She thought about that a lot in those 11 days. The way children and dogs saw past the things you were performing and directly at the things you were. She'd learned to perform fine in the army. You learned it fast, or you didn't last. The ability to present as functional when you were anything but. To project calm in triage when your hands were shaking. To walk into a room where someone was dying and be, in that moment, only what they needed. It was a useful skill. It was also, she had come to understand, a way of losing track of yourself over time. The septic patient's name was Edward Gill. She'd found that out in February, when his daughter had left a voicemail on the hospital's patient relations line that someone had forwarded to her. She still didn't know how. Some act of kindness from within the system, a 4-minute message from a woman named Piper Gill, who said her father had asked her to track down the nurse who'd fought for him, because he wanted to say thank you. Because when he'd come back through the ER that second time, the attending had told him he had maybe 4 hours. Hazel hadn't called back. She'd listened to the voicemail 17 times in the parking garage at the courthouse, where she was filing paperwork for the labor complaint, and she had not called back because she didn't know what she would say, and because she was afraid that if she heard another person's gratitude, she would fall apart in a way she couldn't put back together quickly enough to keep fighting. She called back on day 9 at her sister's house, and Piper answered on the 2nd ring. They talked for 40 minutes. Edward Gill had recovered. He was 71, a retired electrician from outside Columbus, and he grew tomatoes in the summer and watched too much cable news and had learned in the hospital bed, with a specificity that tends to arrive when people get close enough to the edge, that the 2 things he cared most about were his daughter and his garden, and everything else was noise. Piper said he'd said that about 8 times since he'd come home. He wants to write you a letter, Piper said. He doesn't have to. He knows he doesn't have to, she said, and her voice had a particular quality, the kind that comes from watching someone nearly leave and then watching them stay. He wants to. He keeps asking if I've found you yet. The letter arrived at her sister's house on day 11, which was also the day the response from Dillard General came through Vasquez. The hospital's letter was 3 pages of careful legal language that nonetheless contained the words she'd asked for. Retaliatory and without merit, in writing, on letterhead, signed by Marsh and by Alderton. The clinical panel was being convened. Her reinstatement paperwork was attached. Edward Gill's letter was 1 page, handwritten, in the slightly shaky capital letters of a man who'd recently relearned some fine motor skills. You didn't know me. You had no reason to fight that hard, except that it was right. I don't know how to thank you for that, so I'm just going to say it plain. You saved my life. Whatever you're going through, I hope somebody fights that hard for you. She sat at her sister's kitchen table and read it twice. Her nephew came in from the living room, looked at her face and said, "Are you sad again?" "No," she said. "Not this time." He considered this, decided it was probably true, and asked if she wanted to watch a video about excavators. She said yes. She went back to Dillard General on a Tuesday, which was the day she'd always started shifts before, and the unit felt the same and different in the way places do when you've been away long enough to stop taking them for granted. The smell. The particular rhythm of a floor that never fully quiets. 2 of the nurses she'd worked with came and hugged her without saying anything, which was its own kind of language. Marsh was gone. Vasquez had told her not to expect that. It wasn't part of the agreement, technically, but somewhere in the 11 days, the parent company had apparently concluded that the VP of Operations, with the retaliation finding and the pending federal inquiry, was a liability they didn't need. She wasn't sorry. Sutter texted her on her first day back. Just a check-in. Back at work? She sent back. First shift. How's Bravo? He sent a photo. The dog was asleep on what appeared to be a very expensive couch, taking up considerably more than his share of it, wearing an expression of profound contentment. He's coping, Sutter wrote. She laughed out loud in the break room, which startled a resident who hadn't known anyone could laugh like that before 7 a.m. She didn't sell the medals. They're in the deployment box, which is on the top shelf of her closet in a new apartment, slightly smaller than the old one, still in the same neighborhood, because she'd decided she liked the neighborhood and she'd fought too hard to be chased out of it. The hinge is still bent. She keeps meaning to fix it and doesn't, because some things you leave bent on purpose, because they remind you of where they've been. She thinks about the moment the dog walked over sometimes, in the middle of a long shift when her feet hurt and the paperwork won't balance and someone is paging her from 3 directions at once. She thinks about the way it sat, that deliberate, trained stillness, and the way it had known something about her before she'd said a word. She doesn't fully understand it. She's not sure she needs to. What she knows is this. She walked into that pawn shop, ready to let go of the things that had cost her the most, because she had run out of reasons to hold on. And something, a dog, a stranger, a chain of events she still can't entirely account for, had refused to let her. The box stays on the shelf. The hinge stays bent. She stays.